Hello and welcome to the 1916 Company podcast. I'm Tim Masso here with Armand Johnston. And before we jump into today's program, I want to remind you that this is an interactive experience. If you have questions you'd like to forward to us, either questions or show themes, perhaps, send them to podcasts at the1916company.com. Today, we are going to be discussing our favorite watches from outside of the heartland of watchmaking. That's right. There may be some Swiss parts in these watches, but they are all built outside of the old Swiss Federation. So, beyond the cantons of Switzerland, our favorite watches. Armand, set us free.
All right, so I'm going to kick this off with some easy, low-hanging fruit for me. We're going to start right here in the United States with Weiss Watch Company and Cameron Weiss's standard issue field watch. The piece that I'm talking about specifically is the 38 millimeter version. Very clean, very true to a field watch design. Perfect case size, nice Horween leather strap, nice steel case. Just small details that really strike chords with me, such as a matching date wheel.
Okay, nice watch. And did you have the price of that, like for a rough approximation of what someone might pay for one of these?
Retail on this is $2,430.
Okay, so we're talking about Longines, Fortis, ETA or Sellita-powered Oris type money.
And you do get, American-based watchmaking, an interesting company, an interesting story. And, Cameron Weiss seems like a really cool guy, I have to be honest.
Yeah, he does. And right now there does seem to be a resurgence of American watchmaking, but he would have been one of the first to really do it in earnest and to do it in a way that was fairly accessible. I think the AstroTurfed kind of made in the USA backstory and credentials, but he's really done well to offer something that is legitimately American-made that you can still buy for reasonable money. Don't get me wrong, I love Josh Shapiro, I love RGM, Keaton Myrick, but even Devon. Like a lot of these American-made watches, they are very expensive, and that's one quality that the Weiss watches have. They are watches you can go out and buy without having a real heart-to-heart with your significant other, or finding yourself in a situation where you've got to forgo a life milestone to save the money to make it happen. Okay, so for me, I have exactly one of those watches where you have to make a huge decision and sacrifice. So Josh Shapiro started out as a guillocher and also a vice principal. And he was both of those things at once down in Southern California before he slowly moved over full-time to his craft. And between correspondence with Roger W. Smith, associations with likes of David Walter, Artur Akhmaev, and other artisans in the area, he emerged as a guy who was a first-class guilloche dial craftsman. Think Jochen Benzinger, but more SoCal. So he launched his first watch, the Infinity series, in 2022, or maybe it was 2021 into 2022. But by the end of 2022, the series was done, and he'd proven that he could build a product in his atelier. He had a UWD movement from Uhrenwerke Dresden, which is a company owned by Lang & Theiner. He had a very nice case that was available in many metals, including tantalum. And the dial with his signature infinity weave cut was one of many available, but the most popular because it's the most intricate and takes the most time. But he took a big step forward in 2023 with the introduction of the Resurgence. And now we've got a watch that is extraordinarily American-made, no longer with the outsourced case, no longer with the outsourced movement. And in fact, of the 180 parts in the movement, 148 of them, including the escapement and the balance wheel, come from the United States. So he still offers a lot of different dial styles, cases, and even movement styles, and that's where this watch really sets itself apart. I'm going to come out and say that my preference would be the tantalum case option. It's a 38 millimeter watch regardless of size. So 38 millimeters, I'd go with the tantalum case and his blue infinity weave dial with white gold accents. And then the movement, which is also American made, it's made of maillot, or the material often described as German silver, a lovely American pocket watch inspired damascening pattern across the bridges, and they actually really studied up on some of the folks who were involved with Grubel Forsey for a long time, and they did clinics in-house with those people to get their 5 watchmakers up to speed with that level of execution. So between the damascening and the finish, they are spectacular movements too, but it's also worth mentioning that you have a unique option of 3 different movement architectures. The train is the same, so the location of the pivots, the barrel arbor, the escapement, it's the same from movement to movement, but you have 3 distinctly different shapes to the bridges. One is a big old mono bridge that's a little bit like a pocket watch. One is a multi-bridge setup that has this S-shaped center bridge over the center wheel. And then there's one that's highly angular, and although I think that's the most interesting because it's different, I also find it the least appealing. So I'd probably get the standard movement style and tantalum case, and either a dark blue dial with neon green accents or a lighter blue dial with his white gold applique numerals, and let's go with like spade style hands. It's a highly customizable watch. The watch I just described with the tantalum case and some of those embellishments would be about $80,000 US. Manual wind movement, 48-hour power reserve, big slow-beating thing, overcoil hairspring, though with a free-sprung balance, so there are some modern standards there. A lot of money, but if you could have this or a similarly sized and similarly priced used FP Journe Chronomètre Bleu, there are literally, I mean, at this point, there are probably thousands of those because they make over 100 a year. There's only a handful of these J and Shapiro Resurgence pieces out there, and I think he is at the beginning of an incredible career arc, whereas Journe is sort of at the end.
You know, the movement options on this are outrageous. This is such a cool customizable option that you have. I have to stand in a hard line and totally agree with you in terms of the angular movement. It is remarkably interesting, but you know, angles like this, they don't feel organic. They don't feel they don't feel illustrated in an artful way, despite the fact that they very much are. And I think the guilloche on that kind of stands out as something that's the most interesting. But on the subject of the guilloche, what I find awesome about Shapiro in general, and I actually looked at one of these myself, he'll make you a guilloche matching ring, which I think is very cool. I'm not usually into the matching jewelry with watches, but in this case, being that he has his roots as a guillocher, that he has a manufacturer that's capable of doing that, I really like the combo.
Other thing too, it is a multi-piece case, and you can get a mixed metal case. So if you want some rose gold and tantalum, you can do that. But the guilloche of the ring is important to mention because he practiced on rings before he started offering case guilloche on the Resurgence series. So I should have mentioned that you can get external tactile guilloche on the flanks of the case. It looks and it feels great. So lots to love from Josh right there. And he is making movements, cases, and dials in-house right now. So very impressive from a guy who started as a middle-aged vice principal. Okay, Armand, what have you got for me next?
All right. Well, you made mention earlier, but I would love to talk about RGM. RGM is somewhat local to us, Pennsylvania-based watch brand. I've actually had the pleasure of going out, seeing the manufacturer, meeting Roland, and helping a client and friend of mine design his custom timepiece, and it was such a good experience. My personal favorite of RGM's collection is the Army Corps of Engineers, or rather the Corps of Engineers, excuse me. I think it's cool. It's another field watch style, borderlining on pilot watch to a certain degree, with kind of a large crown, big, wide open case back, excessive loom, and just cooler than cool. What's really neat about RGM in general is that Roland will work with you. I know a collecting couple actually who got 2 Corps of Engineers pieces, and one was a left-hand crown, one was a right-hand crown.
Okay, and so the Corps of Engineers is an interesting piece because it's sort of a Lancaster, Pennsylvania continuation of the kind of American Corps of Engineers pocket watch that was made in that same region decades and decades ago. So about 100 years, well, not quite 100 years ago, but getting darn close now. The Corps of Engineers look is almost like something you would find on the original Vacheron Constantin American 1921, like the actual one from the early 1920s. It's got a big sort of fauxtina look to it with simulated radium patina, which some people take, some people leave. But it's the combination of the enamel-style dial with that font and a wristwatch case and RGM's own 801 in-house caliber that makes it particularly appealing. And Roland was a pioneer. He was doing this back in 1992 when no one was talking about making watches in the United States. And I do think that this is more interesting than his flagship Pennsylvania Tourbillon, which feels more Breguet than, Hamilton or Illinois or Elgin, whereas this Corps of Engineers feels very much like the descendant of a great American product.
That's really well said, actually. I think there is a lot of Swiss DNA in the Pennsylvania Tourbillon versus this is very American feeling, this watch, in a fantastic way. I think what's really charming about RGM as well is you go into a small town in the middle of Pennsylvania, you walk into an old bank, and you see 4 rose lathes sitting right in the center. 4 machines that are almost 100 years old. Some of them are over 100 years old, some in various states of repair, some being repaired. And you just see a hive of people working. And there's not a ton of people who work there. I think when I went there were about 4 people, including Roland. And it's just a small, charming manufacturer that has a really cool story and, little quirks, like they still use the original bank vault as their own vault.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of repurposed stuff in there, which is what makes it so endearing. The shop itself, all of the old tools, very little in there that's modern. You're not going to see the banks of CNC machines with their cooling jets and electrospark erosion that you find when you walk into a modern Swiss factory. And I think that's part of the appeal of RGM. I do think that if you buy an RGM or you get a Josh Shapiro, go visit them. Walking into a small sole proprietor shop is an essential part of the experience when you're buying something independent from a maker that works in those volumes. And I've met Roland, and he's always been a gentleman and just a wealth of knowledge and insight, and the kind of person I would want to buy a watch from, certainly. So the whole experience is there. I've also interviewed Josh Shapiro, and he was incredibly generous with his time and insights. So I would endorse both those dudes. Very different styles, but they both love guilloche. That's the common thread. Okay, so I'm going to throw something out there that's a little bit out of left field because we don't talk often about watches made in Hungary. But Aaron Bexei and Bexei Watches collaborated with knife maker Todd Rexford of America on a watch called the Bexei Dignitas Pure Project 20. So it's based on the Dignitas, which is a regular offering from Bexei. Think tank watch, but with a Baroque kick to it. Really, Bexei is a very small brand, previously making only perhaps 6 to 12 watches a year. Aaron has brought in a few extra helpers now to handle his rising prominence in the industry, and I think the combination of the idiosyncratic styles and the uncompromising finish and quality is what I really like here. The Dignitas Pure ZR features hot-hammered zirconium dial and bridges that looks a lot like the materials that Rexford uses to create his distinctive custom cutlery. He is a custom artisanal knife maker, and we know that there are people out there listening who are very into that as well as watches, so please excuse the background. We have some furry friends in-house, but he is a very impressive guy, Bexei, and an uncompromising one. And the Dignitas is probably the simplest watch he makes, and it's roughly the shape and size of something like the Alangu und Söhne Cabaret, but between the hammered zirconium, the knife artistry accents that are baked into the design, and the finishing on the movement, which is gorgeous. Think Grubel Forsey, think Romain Gauthier, think Laurent Ferrier levels of beveling and anglage, think Lang und Heine and Moritz Grossman levels of ratchet wheel solarization, and then that weird hammered zirconium look that you can only find on something from outside the world of horology. This is an interesting mixed genre watch, and one whose quality is self-evident, and it really does a great job of taking something that is non-horological and channeling it. And that's not always a success. You know that. We've seen movie promotions, we've seen automotive crossovers, we've seen attempts to tie watches to various types of pro sports or sporting events like America's Cup, and it almost never works out. I would not have expected a watch and a knife to dovetail so well, but this Dignitas Pure Project 20, really cool piece.
Tim, this is amazing. This is otherworldly, this watch, in a sense of I can see it on a Kryptonian's wrist. There's something that is truly alien about the way that it looks, and I agree with you. You know, collaborations of reaching across industries are sometimes interesting at best, and as a knife collector myself, this is, you know, kind of a weird combo, but I really, really like the combo. I like the case, I like the movement finishing. You know, the handset is maybe what's setting it off as otherworldly to me, because what would you call those shapes?
I wouldn't even know how to characterize them. I think that they're designed to be iconic of Bexei, in the same sense that Journe's hands, the long tapered motif, are iconic of Journe. I also think that with the sharp edges and the peaked points, those hands are a little bit of a nod to the collaborative association of blades and points and cutting edges. And I think that's sort of where that comes from too.
I love being able to see the hammered texture through the beveling. You know, they bevel the edges far enough that it gets into the peaks and valleys of that hammered texture, and it doesn't compromise the look of the finish in any way, despite that the line's not clean.
Yeah, and each one of these is going to be unique, but by definition, you can't hammer a dial or a movement plate the same way twice. I think if you're out there looking for something really special, and I mean really special, if you're looking at Raoul Pages, if you're looking at Josh Shapiro, if you're looking at someone like Marco Lang, you know, now who's independent by himself, or Jochen Benzinger, I think Bexei watches needs to be on your radar. Ivo Loiba would be another one of those super small practitioners in this category. This is a really neat watch, and by the way, Bexei can do other things too. He's got a multi-axial tourbillon that's beyond bonkers. He'll build you clocks if you want. There's a lot of customization inherent here, so if you like this watch maybe 90% but feel there's 10% that could be changed to suit your taste, as with Josh Shapiro, lots of tailoring available. So I cannot say enough good things about Aaron Bexei and Bexei watches, particularly that Dignitas Project 20. Really cool piece. A successful collaborative effort.
Totally agree. That is so cool.
So where else are we headed in today, Armand?
All right, we are going over to Japan now. You know, whenever I think of non-Swiss watches, I go instantly to Seiko, and then Grand Seiko, and then ultimately I ride the train all the way up to Credor. You know, despite not necessarily caring for the newest release of the locomotive, I think things like the Credor Masterpiece line, such as, for example, my personal favorite is the GBLT 996, which is a yellow gold, blue dial, manual wind, just gorgeous Credor masterpiece. What I like about Credor in general is overall attention to detail. You have largely hand-painted dials. You have a lot of man-hours involved in the design, in the finishing, and you also have Grand Seiko and Credor, separate now. Credor likes to mirror nature in their movement architecture in a lot of ways. So for some of their pieces, they'll shape main plates in the shape of mountains. They'll place rubies and jewels in significant portions on the way up that mountain, so to speak, in that movement. And I find that pairing really, really interesting. And I think Credor has a lot to show for what they've done in a relatively short time.
I like that piece, and there's a couple of different versions of it. There's the GBLT 998, which is rose gold with the white porcelain, and I really like the GBLT 997 with the blue. So you have a couple of choices here, which is interesting considering how few of these are made per year, that there would be a couple of variants. It's not customization, but it is choice. I think that these are awesome pieces for the person who is maybe fed up with waiting for a chronomètre bleu from Journe, either because the wait list is too long or the aftermarket premium is too high. And this watch trades at very reasonable money on the market. We've had them pre-owned in the past, and I would say Micro Artist is probably no more than 1 to 2 dozen examples of any one model per year. So considering I've seen proof that Journe's chronomètre bleu has been made up to 110 pieces per year, I think that this is a great way to have something no one else will have, achieve consummate dress watch elegance, and also have something that's probably more distinctive of a national character than the Journe. I don't think the Journe feels like a Swiss watch. I think it feels like a Journe watch. Whereas I think with these porcelain dials and spring drive and black polished, tin plate finished cases, this feels like the best that Japan has to offer. And I think there's a lot of national pride caught up in the production of this model line. So it is one of those things like, the original Acura NSX or the best of Japanese whiskey and guitars, something that really represents almost like a little ambassador from Japan to the world. That's what I like about it.
I think it's also kind of the period at the end of the sentence of there is beauty and simplicity. This watch is time only, with a running seconds, of course. It's manual wine. The case isn't outrageously detailed. The dial isn't outrageously detailed, but it is beautiful regardless.
And nicely sized, too. Easy to wear. So, fantastic piece, by the way, guys. Lost in all that is that we are talking about a spring drive movement. When you're talking about the Micro Artist Studio, we are talking about what's probably the highest evolution of watchmaking quartz. No batteries, no capacitors, no stepper motors. It is a quartz oscillator, but it is mechanically driven and only mechanically driven. It is accurate like a quartz, but it's built like a mechanical watch. There's a lot to love here. The deeper you dig, the more respect you have. And I would also hope affection. Okay. I've got a Japanese watch for you. Actually, I've got two. I'm going to start with something that is very unusual and also very rare, but the Hajime Asaoka chronograph. Now, only built in a handful of examples and very limited. It's not crazy expensive in like the $75,000 to $90,000 range, depending on how you spec it out. But if you like something like Petermann Badat's split-second chronograph or the Grunefeld Grunograph, this is going to be right up your alley. This is a guy who's probably better known for making the affordable Korono Tokyo models than the watches that actually brought him to prominence, which are high horology pieces. But we are talking about an independent watchmaker of the highest HCI style echelon, and he's known for his tourbillon watches. He's known for his tourbillon watches and exclusivity, but his 38 millimeter chronograph is intricate and beautifully finished and dial side exciting in a way that very few chronographs are. So the clutch, the column wheel, all of the chronograph works is on the dial side of this watch. And although Asaoka is very well known for CNCing the bones of his watches, the final execution and decoration of the pieces is purely artisanal, and I think that's where the magic sort of comes together. This is one of those watches that allows you to realize the dream of wearing the coolest kind of display case back upside down. With all the fun on the dial side, you really do get that full benefit. And again, pricing is a little bit difficult to pin down because conversion from yen and whatnot and different types and limited production. I would say somewhere between about $78,000 and $90,000 is what you'd pay for one of these. Really interesting watchmaker, very different about the way he does things. And of course, whenever you're talking about an artisan operating at this level, you do have customization options. I just think this is interesting because as obscure as he is probably to most people who are mainstream in the watch hobby, he's generally known for tourbillon watches, and this is not that. I think this is more interesting than his tourbillon, and I think that it's one of the most defiantly different chronographs in the business, especially if you see it.
I think it's something to point out with this is that it's kind of a chronograph first, more so than anything. You know, the timekeeping portion of it is almost an afterthought, tucked away at the 9 o'clock portion of the movement and lack of dial. It's small, it's off center, and what you see mostly is the large sweeping seconds hand, the large sweeping chrono seconds hand. So I like a chronograph that showcases, hey, this is a chronograph. Here's your timekeeping over here, and the watch is used for a chronograph.
Yeah, it's almost very different implementation, but a little bit like the philosophy behind the Singer Track 1, where you have a chronograph that dominates the dial, and then the time-telling functions are pushed to the periphery, whereas the stopwatch gets pride of place. And I would say that the hours and the minutes on Asaoka's chronograph are almost treated the way small seconds are treated on a conventional chronodial. Marginalized, minimized, and de-emphasized. It's just an awesome watch, and at 38 millimeters, it's one that's really easy to wear. Also, it's a hell of a lot cheaper and easy. Well, I mean, it's a hell of a lot cheaper than the Peterman Badat, which is incredibly expensive. And probably, you know, if you ask nicely, even though it's not a regular production option, probably a little bit easier to get than a Grunefeld chronograph or something like a Kari Voutilainen Masterpiece chronograph.
I love the absolutely massive balance wheel it seems to have also.
Yes, that's a major feature of the watch, and it's exciting on the case back. Don't get me wrong, both sides are interesting. It's just fascinating that it has one giant bridge on the back for most of the train, a separate giant bridge for the free-sprung balance, and it's almost austere in the way the case back is treated with all of the Rococo embellishment on the dial side. So Asaoka, very interesting watchmaker, real great sense of aesthetics, but also, you know, you get that feeling that you're probably not going to see another one at the office. So it's got that appeal too. Okay, what else have we got on the agenda?
All right, so I am going over to Germany now with Moritz Grossman, specifically the Benu 37 Voutilainen dial series. I'm a personal fan of the treated German silver in the rose gold case. I think it overall is a perfect size watch. I'm a sucker for purple, so I really like the purpled hands. I like the shape of the hands. I love the Voutilainen attachment, and I'm an absolute sucker for Moritz Grossman movements. It took me a little bit of time to appreciate it, and truthfully just handling enough of them in person to really appreciate the movements, but I find them beautiful now, and I think they really nailed it with the 37 millimeter case size. It's a gentleman's watch.
Yeah, I can't say enough good things about the manufacturer. My tastes trend a little bit more towards either the dial side movement of the back page or the original tremblage from 2021.
Love tremblage.
The tremblage is probably where you go with Moritz Grossman. I think the ultimate offering from them would be to take their bumper automatic and combine it with a tremblage dial and a steel case, and I can't imagine how that wouldn't be watch of the year and the must-have independent piece. But you do get a lot of options with Moritz Grossman. They have some weird watches like the Universal Zeit that comes out of absolutely nowhere with its multiple time zones and its travel functions. They've got the Tremblage with its artisanal engraved dial, Kari Voutilainen crossover, of course, with this Benu, and then they do have beautifully finished movements, even when they're not their bumper automatic. Their movements don't photograph well because they're fairly pale and monotone. You only sense God in the details when you see it in person. Things like the solarization of the ratchet wheel, the black polishing of the crown wheel core, the freehand engraving on the bridges and plates, the beveling that's perfect, the screws that aren't fired blue, they're fired brown, which takes more care and a quicker hand with the heat. They have things like their own in-house balance, which very few brands even bother to provide. Why buy when you can, or why build when you can buy? That's the attitude most have. And really, you need to see these movements to appreciate them. I've long suspected that this is a brand which, alongside De Bethune, just can't be understood in photographs. Whereas some watches, for example, like the Grunefeld Principia or the Journe Chronomètre Bleu, or I would even say something like the Josh Shapiro Resurgence we talked about earlier, they photograph well. The Moritz Grossman pieces, even the Tourbillon, they just don't show well on camera. And I think the back page is really the only example of one of their watches that defies that. So if you guys are out there in cyberspace and you're kind of following this podcast by shopping the show and browsing these websites, go and check out photos people have taken in natural light of these at trade shows, at watch collector meetups, things that are on Instagram that were taken raw, basically unmodified by photo editing software or studio lighting. They look a lot better in person. You can also see a few of them on my online reviews where basically it's just me with a phone taking some shots. I think these watches look great everywhere but the studio images on their website. So I would almost say use Moritz Grossman's website as a last resort if you want to see what this watch looks like.
I think you nailed it with the monotone nature of the movement and why it doesn't photograph well. I think there's some media blasting or potentially on some of the movement finishing that doesn't necessarily get picked up by photography, but really seeing in person is what changed my mind on the brand, is what educated me further.
Yeah, you can tell the difference here between a company that makes maybe 400 watches a year versus Lange with 5,000 plus, because a lot more time can be spent on stuff that Lange does, but not to the same degree. So, for example, the balance cock and the escape wheel cock, and both these things are engraved, and you'll find them engraved on Lange watches, but the intricacy of the engraving on the Moritz Grossmann, it is almost like the strokes of the volutes and the florisant and the banknote scrolling are much more densely spaced and finer in their execution, and it would have been easy to draw the metal from one trough that is drawn by the graver back into another one, and there is such a thing as engraving that's too dense and starts to deform as each new pass deforms a previous pass. Somehow they managed to get away with an incredibly dense engraving on these structures, and all of them are unique, and none of this is done with an engine of any kind or a guide. It's burn, it's eye, it's hand, it's manual, it's very special, and that's why you really need to spend some time with these. Their screw-based steel micrometric adjustment index for the timing is superbly detailed and holds up under 10 power magnification. I once was told by a watch industry executive who went through the studios at Moritz Grossmann that it was the only watchmaking workshop he'd ever seen where every tool was in the right place, everything was antiseptically clean, every bench was perfect, and it's reflected in the products. A really cool piece. And the Voudelainen connection here gives the watches a little bit more dial side character, because if there's another problem with Moritz Grossmann, it's that aside from the back page, the tremblage, and this Voudelainen crossover, a lot of their dials are kind of anodyne, and this gets away from that. Oh, right. So I know I've been talking about watches that cost tens of thousands of dollars, so let me broach the subject of an affordable Japanese watch. And I'm going to put on my fire retardant suit here because it is quartz. And not spring drive, but quartz. So, asbestos on, Citizen Campanola Grand Complication. This is a watch that came out in 2002, and Citizen is sort of like the eternal rival of Seiko. And Campanola was their flagship before they started adding Swiss brands like Atelier de Monaco and Frédéric Constant. So this is a watch, 43 millimeters in diameter, that is handmade and hand-finished. And you can get them used for between $2,000 and $4,000. I believe it's out of production now, but it was in production for 20 years prior to that. So the 43 millimeter case is manually polished in a process taking hours. It is bright polished and mirror-like, and it uses Citizen's Duratect coating to make it 5 times harder on its surface than regular steel, so it's durable. The dials, more often than not, included hand-laid, cured, and polished urushi lacquer, also rosewood lacquer, flat lacquer, gloss lacquer, a lacquer impregnated with gold flakes and minerals. A very artisanal, slow-going production, the type of thing you might expect on something hailing from the Seiko Micro Artist Studio. So we are talking about a handmade watch, and that continues inside where the the lifetime quality quartz movement in this watch is assembled and tuned by hand. So you have grand complication in the traditional sense. Not a mechanical watch again, but traditionally grand complication is a chronograph, which this has, a perpetual calendar, again, it has it, and a minute repeater. Now, of course, this is an electronic minute repeater, but all three features are present and correct, and it's something that initially was almost exclusively available in Japan. So finding them in the West is not impossible, but you still have to do a little bit of legwork. If you go on Chrono24, you might find somewhere between 8 and 10 of them, maybe 12 available, and you'll pay somewhere between $2,000 and $4,000. And I cannot recommend it highly enough if you're comfortable with luxury quartz and a little bit of a larger watch with something of a more is more aesthetic sensibility. This is a really cool way to go for, again, Oris, Longines, Tudor type money.
That is such an out of left field pick. I would never have guessed that ever. This is interesting. I like the various versions of it. I like the case design. It's not quite round. It's not quite tonneau. There's something that reminds me of like a round 5135 or something. Maybe it's the lugs, maybe it's the overall shape of the case, but it's very interesting. I think it holds its complications well. I love the fact that it's quartz. I have to say, I'm a quartz apologist kind of through and through. And Citizen is a brand that, well, when people say, I want to get my friend, my significant other, a watch, I ask one question. The question is, are they a watch person? If the answer is yes, I recommend one thing. If the answer is no, I solely recommend Citizen. I find Citizen to be such a wearer's watch, whether you're into horology or not, and just easy grab and go. And this is kind of this is really cool because this is peak for them to a degree. It is a grand comp, and that's so cool. I'm also kind of a fan of digital minute repeaters. It's a fun complication that I think something like a Breitling Aerospace Evo wears really well. Something like this wears really well.
Yeah, and it's a good point you mentioned the Breitling Aerospace, because aside from Omega X33, Z33, Breitling Aerospace, you don't have a whole lot of options for electronic minute repeaters in, the traditional chiming style. So this is a fun watch on that basis. And I do agree with you. It's somewhere between a round case and a tonneau case, maybe a little bit like what the Vacheron Malt collection brings to the table. It is a difficult case shape to characterize, but I would say round dial tonneau case. That's probably the way to describe it. But a really cool watch with a lot of different dial variants created over the years. So while you can't customize it, you've got such a plethora of choices from its 2 decades in production. All of them are special in their way. All of them are handcrafted, but the aesthetic does change. So shop around and you'll probably find something you like. Again, the price is right, and Citizen built these to go the distance. This is not something where, you'll go to the mall and they'll pop a new movement in it, because that's how they do. That is not how they do. Before Chronomaster, before Frédéric Constant, Atelier de Monaco, Alpina, before they bought La Joux-Perret, Arnold & Son, and Angelus, this was Citizen's flagship, and it still has the feel of a trophy product. So highly recommended. Okay. Where are we right now, Armand? I think we're getting down to the bottom of our pile, not in quality, but we're kind of like running out.
Certainly not in quality. This is my last pick for the day, but it's among my favorites, and it's among the most affordable. Very in line with the Weiss watchmaking pricing, give or take. The Sin U50, I think, is one of the best mechanical tool watches that money can buy. I think it punches above its weight class. I think it has a great look. It has a great feel, and almost anyone can wear it.
Yeah, really cool piece. And just repeat again, how large is it?
This is a 42 millimeter, but I believe it feels much more like a 40 to me. I'm actually confirming that it's a 42 as we speak.
Yeah, I think it might be
41. Excuse me.
I was going to say I think it might be even a little bit smaller. If you love the Zin U1, but you can't cope with its enormous size, this is a great way to get a lot of the same qualities, and with both bracelet and strap, tegament, hard black, and bare metal options. You have a few aesthetic choices to make. Pricing is reasonable, and we are again in that sort of like Fortis Solida powered Oris kind of price range. This is a huge step up from something like a Seiko SKX. Highly recommended. And again, you're getting a German watch, a very different kind of German school of thought. This is a pure tool watch background. This is not the Autologerie of Glashütte and Dresden. This is from a company that cut its teeth in pilot's watches and now is making a dive watch with the same no holds barred, pure tactical field watch type of sensibility to its style. Legibility and durability over everything. So now I wanted to make sure that Germany was well represented, but I really didn't want to just pick a Lange. I thought maybe the easiest way to do this would be to pick some sort of Seiko and a Lange, and there's nothing wrong with either one, but I'm always interested in being a little bit out of left field with my choices. That said, I don't believe Lange und Heine of Dresden is quite the secret it used to be. I think a lot of people are beginning to realize that if you had a Lange with more soul and better finish, you would wind up with a Lange und Heine. And that's not a knock on Lange. It's just acknowledgement that when you're making, 100 to 200 watches a year, you can do things differently than when you're making over 5,000. So Frederick III, all of the watches made by Lange und Heine are named after electors of Saxony or royals from the House of Wettin. And so this is named after Frederick the Wise, Frederick the Elector. It is a 39.2 millimeter watch available in several different dials and metals, but I find the most compelling to be a blued silver dial, so galvanized blue sterling silver in a steel case. It has the company's distinctive pike-style hands, but they're filled with a high-ceram white ceramic material. And then 39.2 millimeters, you're talking about 10.7 millimeters thick. It's slim, it's compact. Even with a Roger Dubuis-style triple lug, it wears well on a smaller wrist. I would take it 11 out of 10 times over something like the FP Journe Chronomètre Bleu, or even the Lange und Söhne Saxonia Thin Copper Blue. Frederick is this good. So if you're going to buy the Fred, you got to know that the movement exhibits two things that are exceptional. We talk about finish, but you can take a very orthodox movement architecture. Many brands have taken 6497s and 6498s and decorated them to a Baroque level. And many German brands have decided to copy a Lange und Söhne with one big three-quarter pocket watch style monobridge. But what Lange und Heine does here is they create what they call a trigonal bridge. What I can tell you is that it's more of an island in the middle of the movement that is stripped down to the bare amount of area necessary to contain the crown wheel, the ratchet wheel and barrel, the drivetrain, and then the escapement. So you have big open base plate visible where they freehand engrave all of the characters in a beautiful fashion. Everything is media blast because we're paying tribute to an era before Côte de Genève and Streifen were present on watches. They give you probably more color than any movement I've ever seen between the silvers, the golds, the rose, the blue, the violet, the pivot jewels, and the fact that the wheels themselves are open and visible lets you appreciate how beautiful they are. They're in rose gold. They're hand-finished inside and out. They have a degree of decoration that you don't get on a Lange. And then we've got a balance cock that features actual solid gold construction, intricate engraving, a black polished swan's neck fine adjustment mechanism, and a diamond capstone atop the balance pivot. This is a very special movement and it has all of the things that you love about fine watch finish, from anglage to black polish, media blast on the base plate and the bridges. You've got a double solarized ratchet wheel atop the barrel, single solarized crown wheel, and then you have micro beveled teeth on the crown wheel and the ratchet wheel, where you can see just how much time was really spent here. There's also both polished and blued screws, which you don't always get on watches, and the one on top of the barrel holding the ratchet wheel in place is the most perfectly profiled screw I've ever seen. It has a perfect splayed V chamfer. It has a perfect bevel around its circumference, and it's mirrored on its top. This is the proverbial €100 screw because of the time spent on it and the qualifications of the person who decorated it. I don't believe you can get better finish on a watch. And pre-owned, these are going to be $33,000 to $35,000. So retail for a Chronomètre Bleu is now almost 40 grand. Aftermarket, what Armand, 80?
Yeah, 80 to 90, give or take.
Yeah, so this is easily the way to go. And from a really small brand, in good hands, although neither Long und Heine still work there. Jens Schneider from Moritz Grossman is now their director of development, and he is best in the business quality. So I expect them to continue to hit new high highs. Buy this movement as much for its architecture as its finish. Finish is decoration. Architecture is the size, proportion, shape, and relative positioning of the parts. This has both.
The architecture is gorgeous. What you mentioned about the bridges being as diminished as possible, the open wheels, the depth of the finishing in general is just truly outrageous. Tim, real quick, without going on a tangent, what is the significance of the German hand-engraved balance cock?
It's just a nod to the past. For the same reason they use German silver instead of rhodium-plated brass, for the same reason they use little golden chaton cups fixed by screws, for the same reason they use giant three-quarter plates for drivetrain and barrel. It is really something that originated with Lange in the early 90s when you had a self-consciously reborn brand that was trying very hard to tie itself to the pre-communist Saxon watchmaking tradition. And so a lot of visual cues were recruited into that effort. If there's any, I guess, unfortunate fallout from that, it's that almost all of the really high-end German watches, including the original in-house calibers from Long und Heine, they kind of surrendered to that three-quarter bridge, which is maybe historically true, but not very interesting to look at. So they went really heavy into that freehand engraved balance cock so that you would have something that was eye-popping and special and unique. And I think what Long und Heine did so well here is they said, wait, we don't need to have a pocket watch bridge. It's not as cool as what we could do in its stead. And I think this watch is proof of that. If you love the look of something like the Dotograph, you got to ask, what's different between the Dotograph and the rest of the Lange watches? And it's the architecture of the Dotograph movement. It's all the tiers of bridges, clutches, levers, horns, resetting hammers. That's why the Dotto seems so special. Whereas the Lange 1 seems accomplished, but maybe not the most exciting. And I think with Frederick III here, you've got a great attempt by Long und Heine to create its own visual signatures and really break free from the design hegemony of Lange in East German watchmaking today. All right, Armand, where can they find us?
You can find me on Instagram at It's Me Armand or Armand at the1916company.com.
And I am Tim_Masso on Instagram or tmasso at the1916company.com for all of your purchase and pricing questions. With your topics and suggestions and questions for future podcasts, email podcasts at the1916company.com. Hey guys, thanks for your time in every sense. Time out, Tim out, Armand out. Thanks for logging on.